Chapter 2: The Creation of Adolescence. How many roads must a man walk down before they call him a man? Bob Dylan, Blowin' in the Wind. Overview. Adolescence is the creation of modern industrialization, which got into high gear in the United States between 1880 and 1920. For most of human history before the industrial era, young people worked side by side with adults as soon as they were able, and it was not uncommon for young people, and especially young females, to marry and establish independent households soon after puberty. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that adolescence was identified as a separate stage of life characterized by storm and stress. In what appears to be a vicious cycle of cause and effect, teen turmoil since the late 1800s has generated a large number of unique laws that restrict teen behavior in ways that adult behavior has never been restricted, and these laws in turn appear to have stimulated more extreme forms of misbehavior in teens. The rate at which such laws have been passed has increased substantially since the 1960s, with an increasingly wide range of new crimes being invented just for young people. The social reforms that created such laws were set in motion by some formidable individuals, not all of whom had benevolent motives. The extension of childhood past puberty has benefited a large number of new businesses and industries offering a wide range of products and services to the growing teen markets. In ancient youth, the ambiguity and the absence of adolescence in Greco-Roman society. Dutch historian Mark Klagebeck notes that counselors in ancient Greco-Roman municipalities were sometimes as young as 4, or perhaps even younger. One is the proud father of several precocious children. I'd love to be able to testify that any bright child could hold such a position, but the picture that comes to mind is just too preposterous. How could a toddler have served as a counselor in one of the great ancient city-states? The answer, says Klagebeck, is that many of these high positions were probably ceremonial. In some cases, prominent families probably bought these positions in order to increase family prestige. In other cases, the young person was groomed over a period of years, becoming active in significant ways by age 17 or 18 and eventually securing real political power. More important for our purposes, Klagebeck also notes that young people holding political office were no longer regarded as children but as apprentice adults. He also insists throughout his book that adolescence as we know it today simply didn't exist in the ancient world, that youth in pre-industrial society was in character and behavior essentially different from that of modern adolescence. Adolescence as we characterize it today, as a distinct and separate period of life filled with angst and rebelliousness, is, quite simply, a fairly recent phenomenon in human history. History lessons. Consider the following passages from various works on the history of childhood and adolescence. The teenager is a recent idea that may not deserve to be an eternal one. Thomas Hine, The Rise and Fall of the American Teenager. For in the bad old days people learned who they were, and what their place in the eternal order of things was to be, by looking at the progression of generations that stretched behind them. Today other roads than that of family lineage lead to immortality. Adolescents now soon realize that they are not links in a familial chain stretching across the ages. Who they are, and what they become is independent, at least so they believe, of who their parents are. Other agencies now socialize and control the young. The continuity between the generations falls. Edward Shorter, The Making of the Modern Family. 5. Although the architects of adolescence often announce their intention to understand and to sympathize with the problems of adolescence, a major effect of the psychological interest in adolescence after 1890 was the creation of new ways to regulate youthful behavior. Joseph F. Kett, Rites of Passage, Adolescence in America, 1790 to the present. 6. Our society has passed from a period which was ignorant of adolescence to a period in which adolescence is the favorite age. We now want to come to it early and linger in it as long as possible. Felipe Ayres, Centuries of Childhood. 1. As you can see, a number of people have written about the invention of adolescence in modern times, as well as about the ways in which the modern world has isolated young people from adults. Not all historians view young people the same way, however. Historical viewpoints. It's convenient to separate modern historians of childhood and adolescence into two groups, sentimentalists and continuists. Sentimentalists. The sentimentalists include historians such as Mark Klagebeck, the Frenchman Philippe Ayres, Hugh Cunningham of the University of Kent, Edward Shorter of the University of Toronto, Lawrence Stone of Princeton University, and the British historian J. H. Plum, among others. Sentimentalists believe, generally speaking, that perspectives on children and teens have changed dramatically in recent centuries. Prior to the industrial era beginning, roughly, in the mid-1700s, young people weren't distinguished from adults in many respects. They worked alongside adults, especially in rural areas, and they were integrated partially or fully into adult society at a young age, sometimes well before puberty, but certainly shortly thereafter. Gene Lidloff's picture of life among the Yekwana Indians in South America fits this model. According to the sentimentalist historians, at some point, at least in the United States and some countries in Europe, young people began to be isolated from adults, and the prevailing attitudes about young people changed. They were no longer seen as reasonably capable members of society, rather, they became sentimentalized. Children were increasingly seen as helpless and incompetent beings requiring adult protection, and the age at which young people were defined as children steadily increased over the decades. As I noted in Chapter 1, in England in 1788, children under 8 were said to require protection from various labor practices. By 1833, protection was deemed necessary for young people aged 13 and under. Modern laws have extended the protection to age 18, or, for some purposes, to 21. Continuists. Other historians, such as Princeton's Natalie Zeman Davis, Emil Aben of Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, Linda Pollock of Tulane University, Harvard's Stephen Osman, and Barbara Hannawald of Ohio State University, can be termed continuists in the sense that they claim, based on their examination of records in certain countries during certain eras, that perspectives on childhood and adolescence have been at least somewhat continuous over time, or that children and teens haven't changed much. Young People in Action. Jimmy Carter on guns. By the time I was 5 or 6 years old, I had been carefully instructed in the proper use of firearms, beginning with a BB gun, then a Remington .22 semi-automatic rifle, and finally a bolt action .410 gauge shotgun. 8 I believe we can largely set aside the continuist perspective for a number of reasons, the main one being that when you look closely at what these historians have written about teens, but not necessarily what they've written about young children, their writings tend to be consistent with my position. Without exception, they certainly find far more differences between historical and modern teens than they find similarities. For example, in the 1993 volume Growing Up in Medieval London, Hannawald asserts that the Middle Ages did recognize stages of life that corresponded to childhood and adolescence. But she also notes that proponents of the non-existence of childhood and adolescence in the Middle Ages have widespread support among professional historians. 9 And that the medieval world did not have names for these stages of life. 10 She also describes a teen world that is as different from the modern one as, say, Joan of Arc is from contemporary pop diva Britney Spears. For example, although she takes issue with other historians about the age at which children entered various work professions, putting little emphasis on how much work they did at home, she still has them starting apprenticeships as young as age 7. She also notes repeatedly that there was a tendency for the age of entry into various professions to creep up over the centuries, for adults to postpone both the symbols and the reality of adult life to later ages. 11 Most important, she acknowledges just how radically different the medieval teen world was from the modern one. It is perhaps the question of influence that most distinguishes between adolescence then and now. No full-fledged youth subculture in which peers were the chief influence on an adolescent's life existed in the Middle Ages. There was no youth culture, as opposed to a broader society culture, nor were there juvenile delinquency and juvenile sentencing, as opposed to adult criminal behavior and punishment. 12 Hannawald also notes that young medieval Londoners often married young and set up independent households, but let's stop here. No youth subculture, apprenticeships with adults at young ages, no juvenile delinquency, and no term for adolescence. Bear in mind that this is coming from a continuist historian focusing on one of the best places in the world, London. To expect historical continuity. Was childhood an invention? The first major work on the history of childhood was published in French by Philippe Aries in 1960, published in English in 1962.13 Based on his examination of historical records, largely in France, Aries propounded a fairly radical idea, namely that the concept of childhood was an invention of 18th and 19th century Europe, making its way to France around 1900. It didn't become a general phenomenon, said Aries, until after the end of World War I. 14 Adolescence came even later, said Aries. During the 20th century, adolescence expanded, it encroached upon childhood in one direction, maturity in the other. 15 Eventually, he said adolescence came to dominate modern society. Aries based his ideas on a wide variety of records, among them, letters, works of fiction, paintings and school registers, which led him to draw the following conclusions, among others, inconsistent language. Various words, such as child, baby, youth, schoolboy, scholar, and student, enfant, pure, adolescence, etc., were used inconsistently and sometimes interchangeably until recent centuries. The terms could refer to people of a wide range of ages, even to people we now call adults. A term such as child typically designated a family relationship or a state of dependence, not an age. 16 Odd portrayals of children in art. According to Aries, medieval art until about the 12th century did not know childhood or did not attempt to portray it. It is hard to believe that this neglect was due to incompetence or incapacity. It seems more probable that there was no place for childhood in the medieval world. 17 When images of children did begin to turn up, he says, it was common for children to be dressed in adult clothes, or, in many cases, the child was represented by a shrunken image of an adult, without any of the characteristics of childhood. 18 In some forms of art, children appeared naked, but they never appeared in children's clothes, and they were sometimes portrayed with adult musculature. What's more, said Aries, children's toys didn't turn up in paintings until at least the 18th century. Paintings of children on their own were also late in coming, presumably because adults and young people were so intermingled until recent times. Aries mentions exceptions, the realistic portrayal of children in ancient Greek art, realistic depictions of the baby Jesus and so on, but he insists that realistic, sentimental portrayals of children were largely absent from European art until recent times. Lack of caring. Perhaps the most controversial of Aries' claims is that until recent times, parents simply didn't care very much about their children. I remember being appalled when I read Victor Hugo's Les Miserables a few years ago, in overzealous preparation to see the musical, by the apparent indifference that French parents of the early 19th century had toward their children. Eponine, Gavroche and other prominent characters in the book were children and teens abandoned and forgotten by their parents, fending for themselves on the streets of Paris. In that world, it seemed as natural as daylight for a savvy 10-year-old to be in charge of a gaggle of toddlers, all stealing and begging for their food. The indifference, Aries claimed, was a result of many factors, among them the extremely high mortality rate among infants and children in medieval Europe, perhaps 20 to 40%. The general feeling was, and for a long time remained, that one had several children in order to keep a few, he wrote. The 16th century philosopher Montaigne once wrote, I have lost 2 or 3 children in their infancy, not without regret, but without great sorrow. 19 Such an attitude may shock our present-day sensibility, writes Aries, especially the fact that Montaigne didn't even know exactly how many children he had lost, but that attitude prevailed until recent times. Intermingling of children and adults. Aries' most persuasive arguments grow from records he produces from various schools which show, unequivocally, that people of very different ages studied together routinely until very recent times. We're all familiar with the movie images of the prairie schoolhouse of the Old West, where young children and teens somehow learned together in the same room. Records from medieval schools in Europe show that this kind of arrangement was standard. At the Jesuit College of Caen in the 1600s, for example, class registers show a mixing of students from ages 9 to 20 in various classes. At a school in Chalon, they run from 8 to 24.20. Many of these ages were presumably estimated. Aries shows that in many families, even prominent ones, parents didn't keep track of the exact ages of their children. It was also not uncommon for people to complete their studies by their early teens. People we would now call prodigies emerged fairly frequently under this system, a rarity today. For hundreds of years in medieval Europe, age seemed to mean little or nothing in the dispensing of education. Young people and adults were also amply mixed in a wide range of professions, agriculture, crafts, law and so on. Ability, need, and opportunity were the forces that determined where young people turned up. Age seemed to be completely irrelevant. Aries in perspective. In a recent article in The New Yorker, staff writer Joan Ococella reviews a new volume of historical essays about the family structure in Europe, posing and trying to answer an important question: when did we start treating children like children? 21 She surveys much of the relevant literature, including recent essays and books that challenge Aries' views. But the more she digs, the more frustrated she becomes, eventually rejecting the tendency of modern historians to excuse and rationalize the cruelest behaviors imaginable in order to convince us that people have always loved and cared for their children the same way we do today. The apologetic views of one such historian, Linda Pollock, leave Ococella gasping for air. Aries may have gone too far, but his revisionists appear to be guilty of a great deal of wishful thinking. Did some parents love and cherish their children as we do today? Of course. Even in Les Mis, one of the main storylines is about such caring, Jean Valjean's devotion to Cosette. But in other respects, children were often treated with indifference or cruelty. Attorney and legal scholar Donald T. Kramer, author of the definitive 3-volume Legal Rights of Children, sums things up starkly. In ancient times, children were considered to be chattels owned by their parents, who had the right to do more or less what they wanted to do with them. They could educate them or not, as they so chose. They could inflict heinous corporal punishment on them or not, as they so chose. They could afford them medical treatment when needed or not, as they so chose. In In short, children in early times all too frequently bore the same relationship to their parents as slaves did to their masters. 22 Historians, as is their tradition, will continue to debate Ari's thesis for many years. 23 But at least some of the basic facts are clear, and I don't see how even the most zealous continuist historian 24 could deny them. For most of human history until the time of the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of children worked alongside adults as soon as they were able, and they transitioned to partial or full adulthood by their early, mid, or late teens. Even today, many and perhaps even most of the world's children, primarily in developing nations, follow this course. Chapter 3. In contrast, in most industrialized countries today, teens are almost completely isolated from adults. They're immersed in teen culture, required or urged to attend school until their late teens or well into their 20s, largely prohibited from or discouraged from working, and largely restricted, when they do work, to demeaning, poorly paid jobs. Through most of human history and in most locales on Earth, young people, females especially, married soon after puberty and often set up independent households after marriage. 25 In contrast, today in the United States the median age of first marriage is 27.7 for males and 26.0 for females. 26 It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that the teen years came to be seen as dark and tumultuous, and that adolescence was recognized as a separate stage of life that coincided with those years. Young People in Action. Young Leaders. David G. Farragut entered the U.S. Navy in 1810 at age 9, commanded his first ship at age 12, and became Commander-in-Chief of the Navy during the Civil War. President Andrew Jackson fought in America's Revolutionary War at age 14 and was captured by the British. The legendary Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt came into power at age 17. Call. David Hackworth, one of America's most decorated soldiers, entered the Army at age 15 by faking his age. The INFANTILIZATION of teens. In Chapter 1 I summarized the results of a survey I conducted with average teens, average adults, United States Marines and incarcerated felons. The survey suggested that teens are subjected to far more restrictions than are any of the other groups, to roughly twice as many restrictions as incarcerated felons and active duty Marines, and to more than 10 times as many as everyday adults. I also posed questions about the history of such restrictions. Were teens always limited in these ways? Can teens of times past drink, smoke, or make medical decisions for themselves? Because this book is mainly about teens in the United States, I approached the issue by tracking down as many relevant laws as I could find in the United States over the last 300 years. When I began this pursuit, I was worried that older laws would be harder to find than newer ones, which could easily produce a distorted picture. One might mistakenly conclude that the rate at which such laws are being enacted is increasing, not because it actually is increasing but simply because the older laws are inaccessible. As I looked into this further, my worries decreased, mainly because in many cases I was able to determine that newly enacted laws were the first of their kind, laws restricting drinking or skateboarding, for example, or laws requiring helmets for bicycle riding. My search yielded a dramatic picture. Figure 2.1. Before 1700, I could find only a few relevant laws, such as a 1641 Massachusetts law prohibiting anyone 16 and over from cursing or smiting their parents, and a related Massachusetts law punishing a stubborn or rebellious son. 27 The penalty for each offense was death, but I wasn't able to find evidence of executions. During the entire 18th century I found only a few new laws of unique character and then a few more during the early 1800s. But from the mid-1800s onward I found a steady and substantial accumulation of restrictive laws, about 50 distinctive laws between 1850 and 1960. Perhaps the biggest surprise was the sudden increase in rate that began in the 1960s. I found about 90 unique laws over the last 4 decades of the 20th century. See Appendix 5 for a timeline of such laws, plus a look at new laws that are proliferating. Just what is it that teens aren't allowed to do, and why the burst of new restrictions in the late 20th century? Widespread restrictions. As we saw in Chapter 1, there are many ways in which teens are restricted. Only a fraction are specifically encoded in laws. For example, one must be 18 to deliver newspapers in California, but that's not strictly a matter of law. Rather, many papers now require the carriers to drive, to carry liability insurance, or to be able to sign contracts as independent contractors. 28 You can't fulfill any of these requirements these days when you're 12, my age when I got my first paper route. There also aren't specific laws, as far as I can tell, that say that teens can't pick their own friends, make their own religious decisions and so on. But the broad powers a parent has as a teen's custodian, shared, to some extent by teachers and other authority figures, leave teens tightly under the control of adults. Many restrictions are created by laws that don't seem particularly broad on their face but that have sweeping effects. For example, hundreds of activities in our society require contracts: getting married, buying vehicles, getting credit cards, cell phones, bank loans or insurance, and young people can't engage in any of them unless mom or dad signs on, which gives parents derivative powers. Let's not mince words. Because of the contract restriction alone, parents are in an excellent position to control young people through coercion. If you don't finish washing those dishes, you are not getting the car tonight. Sound familiar? Figure 2.1. Infantilization of teens over time. Cumulative number of newly enacted local, state, and federal laws of unique character that restricted the behavior of young people under 18 in the United States, grouped by decade, from 1700 to 1999. There are only a few pertinent laws before 1700, most notably two laws created by the General Court of Colonial Massachusetts in the 1640s condemning young people to death for smiting their parents or being stubborn or rebellious. The steeper the curve, the faster the laws are being enacted. Note the dramatic increase in rate after 1960. Putting such issues aside for the moment, let's take a look at how some specific laws evolved in the United States. The recent era, from the 1960s on, deserves special treatment. For now, let's focus on the period from the mid-1800s to about 1960. Restricting the labor of young people. Many of the early laws restricting the behavior of young people were related to work. At first, the laws focused on work that put young people at risk. Later, they began to focus on all work, no matter how benign. Some were promoted by concerned thinkers and leaders, many of them dynamic women, insisting that young people needed to be protected, and some by groups or individuals protecting their economic interests, labor unions and wealthy industrialists, for example. Courts frequently struck down such laws on various grounds. As we've seen, one of the first laws in the world intended to limit labor by young people, largely ineffective, was enacted in England in 1788. England continued, in small increments, to restrict child labor through legislation passed in the 19th and 20th centuries, but by 1891 the minimum age for child labor had still only increased to age 11.30. Young people in action. Bad news for teens. Bob, the middle-aged man sitting next to me on an airplane, didn't believe me when I told him you have to be 18 to deliver newspapers in California. He was 11, he says, when he got his first route. Under California Labor Code Section 1298, people as young as 12 can indeed deliver papers under some circumstances. But most publishers, concerned about liability, stopped handing newspapers to minors years ago. They want their carriers to be independent adults who can sign contracts absolving the publisher from liability for damages they might incur during deliveries. Although a court decision in Pennsylvania says that even minors who deliver papers are independent contractors, California publishers aren't buying it. When, in some cases, adult carriers hand papers to minors to deliver, concerned citizens complain, as the Sacramento Bee found out recently. Bee circulation manager Connie Cohn insists that they give papers to adults only. After that, you are done with it. 29. In the United States, the child labor movement also moved ponderously, at least at first. Pennsylvania passed the first relevant law in 1848, prohibiting young people under 12 from working in certain kinds of mills. A few other states had already passed weak laws restricting the work hours of young workers, usually to 10 per day, but a 2000 study of the era by economists at Vanderbilt University concludes that early child labor laws and closely related compulsory schooling laws were ineffective. 31. A comprehensive 1937 study of child labor in the United States by Catherine Dupree Lumpkin and Dorothy Wolfe Douglas explains why early child labor laws were often short-lived and almost always came with gaping loopholes. A law passed in 1849 in Maine, for example, was repealed the next year, and an early New Hampshire law could be circumvented with written consent of parent or guardian. 32. By 1879, only 7 states had child labor laws in place, and all were being ignored or circumvented to some extent. But in 1903, Illinois, the state that had recently opened the world's first juvenile court, passed a strong child labor law that also required young people to attend school, and by 1918 all states had joined the bandwagon with relevant laws of varying sorts. 33. The year 1900 was a turning point for child labor in the United States, mainly because of that year's census results. The census revealed that more than 18% of America's young people between ages 10 and 15, about 2 million individuals, were working long hours in factories, mines, mills, fields and stores. It wasn't at all uncommon for young children to be working 13 hours a day for $2 or $3 a week. The census figures helped stimulate a national movement to prohibit most labor by young people. The National Child Labor Committee, NCLC, founded by Felix Adler in 1904, spearheaded legislative efforts nationally, equating labor by young people with slavery. According to Adler, the labor practices of his day led to the physical, mental and moral degeneration of hundreds of thousands of future fathers and mothers and prevented that future growth, that development of American civilization, that new type of manhood which we must give to the world in order to contribute to the world's riches. 34 Although Adler's passionate concerns about the exploitation of young people in factories were legitimate, he appeared to overlook the fact that young people had proudly worked alongside adults throughout human history. Should young people be entirely cut off from the working world, and from adults, because of the exploitative practices of the factories? The NCLC was only partially effective in lobbying for comprehensive labor laws. In 1906, the U.S. Senate considered a proposal by Senator Albert J. Beveridge to limit child labor, but his colleagues argued that the federal government lacked the authority to do so, and the proposal died. In 1908, Adler hired photographer Louis W. Hine to travel the country documenting the harsh use of young people in factories, and his moving photos of soot-covered children leaving mine shafts and dirty children standing near ominous-looking machines were widely circulated. 35 Finally, in 1916, Congress passed the ambitious Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which prohibited young people under 14 from working in non-agricultural industries that produced goods intended for export to other countries or transport across state lines. Note that this was indirect legislation. Congress couldn't regulate child labor directly, but it could control interstate commerce. Just 2 years later, in Hammer v. Dagenhart, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the law on the grounds that Congress had no business interfering with local labor matters through such indirect means. The case had been brought by the father of 2 young men, one under the age of 14 years and the other between the ages of 14 and 16 years, in Charlotte, North Carolina, who argued that his offspring had a constitutional right to work. 36 Just a few months after the Supreme Court's decision, Congress passed a similar law, this one based on the federal government's ability to levy taxes. Once again, the Supreme Court nullified the law. 37 Undaunted, the NCLC and other organizations lobbied hard for Congress to pass a constitutional amendment empowering Congress to limit labor by people under age 18, and the amendment passed both houses in 1924. For the amendment to be binding, however, 36 state legislatures had to ratify it within a few years, but only a handful did so, another major blow for the movement to end labor by young people. The 1929 stock market crash and the ensuing Great Depression gave a boost to the movement, mainly because jobs were suddenly so scarce that leaders were desperate to exclude as many people as they could from the job market. With perhaps 27% of the population out of work, the 1933 National Industrial Recovery Act established a minimum of age 16 for workers in most industries. This is where the magical age of 16, still with us today, was first born on the national level. Young people were also excluded from working in hazardous industries up to age 18. But the Supreme Court struck down the law in 1935, again on constitutional grounds. 38 The exigencies of the Depression ultimately won out over the Supreme Court's concerns. The Walsh-Healey Public Contracts Act, passed in 1936, prevented firms handling federal money from employing females under 18 or males under 16. If you wanted a federal contract, you had to fire your young employees, pure and simple. Congress still uses this strategy today. The federal government can't meaningfully require people to wear seat belts, for example, because it doesn't control the roads, but it can, and does, force states to enact their own seatbelt laws by withholding federal highway construction funds from states that won't pass such laws. The Walsh-Healey Act stuck, more or less, and so did the comprehensive 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. These laws laid the foundation for the labor system we have today, specifying, among other things, a. that young people are prohibited from working in interstate commerce, b. that you must be 16 to work full-time, c. that you must be 18 to work in certain hazardous professions, d. that you can't work while school is in session. In other words, school is more important than work, e. that young people can't work without permits, and f. that people from age 14 to 16 can work a very limited number of hours in some professions. 39 The role of labor unions. None of these changes would have been possible without the strong support of organized labor, which had compelling economic motives for opposing labor by young people. Industrialization created a new affluent middle class and an extremely wealthy upper class, but it did so at the expense of millions of exploited laborers. It also pushed aside the centuries-old apprentice system that had allowed generations of young people to transition smoothly from childhood to adulthood. In many of the new factories, with machines doing much of the work, almost any kind of laborer would do, and the cheaper the labor the better. The availability of youth workers, immigrants and women drove the wages of skilled workers ever downward and left many adult males unemployed. As labor union pioneer Samuel Gompers put it, the introduction of machinery, the subdivision of labor, the use of women's and children's labor and the lack of an apprentice system, drove the skilled trades to the level of pauper labor. 40 in some cases young people, working for very low wages, were given jobs in factories where their own fathers had been laid off. 41 It was inevitable that as workers organized themselves into unions in order to protect their jobs and improve their wages and working conditions, they fought all forms of youth labor vehemently. Organized labor was, according to historians, both the head as well as the body of the movement to prohibit young people from working. 42 As early as the 1830s, groups such as the New England Workingmen's Association and the General Trades Union were agitating to put appropriate laws in place. In its very first platform in 1881, the newly formed Federation of Trade and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada, forerunner of Samuel Gompers' American Federation of Labor, eventually the AFL carbon monohypoiodite, made the youth labor issue a high priority. We are in favor of the passage of laws in the several states forbidding the employment of children under 14 in any capacity, under penalty of fine and imprisonment. 43 Between 1881 and 1905, 37,000 strikes took place in the United States involving over 7 million workers. Many were violent. 44 Workers were, understandably, determined to get a fair share of the obscene wealth of the new industrialists, and the youth issue remained central. With child labor laws facing strong opposition, mainly from manufacturers, but also from young people and families who needed the income, in 1897, the AFL became the first organization in the United States to push for a constitutional amendment prohibiting all forms of youth labor, a concept, as I mentioned earlier, that finally got the support of Congress in 1924.45. In the early years of the new century, the AFL was also a major force behind new laws raising the minimum working age to 16 or higher. Requiring child labor. Curiously, some of the first child labor laws ever enacted were meant to encourage child labor rather than limit it. In the 1690s, the British philosopher John Locke advised English authorities to set up working schools in every parish that would prepare children aged 3 and over to work in the largely home-based spinning and weaving industries. 46 Leaders of this era were intent on keeping young people busy, especially the children of the poor. According to Hugh Cunningham, potentially industrialization offered a solution to a problem which had long irked the elite of Europe: the idleness of children, and idle hands, as the saying goes, are the devil's tools. 47 Combine such thinking with the intense Puritan work ethic, and it shouldn't surprise you that some of America's first child labor laws were polar opposites of 20th century laws. In a 1908 essay on child labor, reformer Edith Abbott said that early American policy makers were obsessed with the issue of idleness among children. 48 In 1640, for example, the Great and General Court of Massachusetts required the magistrates of the several towns to see what course may be taken for teaching the boys and girls in all towns the spinning of the yarn. The following year the same authority directed all masters of families to see that their children and servants should be industriously employed so as the mornings and evenings and other seasons may not be lost as formerly they have been. 49 In 1672, Boston officials directed a list of people to dispose of their several children abroad for servants. If not, the selectman will take their said children from them and place them with such masters as they shall provide according as the law directs. The children, said Abbott, were as young as 8. Connecticut, Rhode Island and other American colonies had similar laws. Children who were idle or who loitered were routinely bound out, indentured outside their homes. 50 Authorities in colonial America would have been appalled by the new type of child labor laws that emerged in the late 1800s. In early America, child labor was a good thing. This would presumably be a problem for Continentalist historians. Forcing school attendance. The trend in labor laws is shadowed by a similar trend in education laws. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the same law even covered both areas. The idea is simple enough: we don't want young people to work, even if they want to work and have opportunities to work without being exploited. We want them to attend school, even if they don't want to attend school and aren't ready to learn. Young people in action. Reigning king at 16. Sometimes when young rulers are crowned, older stand-ins do the real decision-making. But according to the Book of Chronicles, Uzziah, the 10th king of Judah, began to rule at age 16, and his leadership in Jerusalem was successful for 52 years. He built and fortified towers, fought off the Philistines, raised bountiful crops and prepared great weapons for war. The first education laws in the United States were enacted in Massachusetts, which stayed well ahead of the curve for more than 2 centuries. Colonial Massachusetts established the first public school in America, the Boston Latin School, in 1635, barely 15 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. In 1642, the Massachusetts Bay School Law was enacted, requiring parents to provide a modest education for children and servants but not necessarily in school. By 1827, Massachusetts had established the nation's first statewide, tax-supported public school system, but the big shift came in 1852, when Massachusetts made school attendance compulsory for all children, requiring young people between 8 and 14 to attend school at least 3 months a year, unless, that is, the individual could demonstrate that he or she had already learned the relevant material. In other words, this law was competency-based. You were exempt if you could demonstrate competence. The rest of the nation was unimpressed. Not a single state followed Massachusetts' lead for another 15 years. Beginning in 1867, compulsory education laws began to spread, but it wasn't until 1918, 66 years after Massachusetts took the lead, that all states finally had such laws. 51 The impact of the early laws was minimal, perhaps increasing actual school attendance by only 5%. 52 It's no coincidence that the compulsory education laws emerged in parallel with the laws restricting youth labor. Figure 2.2. As we'll see, some of the same people were driving both efforts, and both were propelled in part by the underlying belief, new in human history, that young people are helpless and incompetent. The compulsory education movement was also driven by other concerns of the day. With America's immigrant population swelling daily, there were almost 9 million immigrants during the first decade of the 20th century alone. Some felt that compulsory education was the best way to Americanize the rapidly changing population. Other reformers felt that compulsory education was the best way to try to reduce the widening gap between the new industrial rich and the hordes of poor who were toiling in the factories. As we'll see, the industrialists themselves sometimes supported compulsory education as a way of producing skilled workers and as a way of keeping the masses in check. Finally, with Germany's expansionist policies driving the world toward its First World War, American policymakers took serious note of the fact that Germany, or at least Prussia, a part of modern Germany, had had a compulsory education system in place since 1717.53. In contrast, England didn't require every community to have a school until 1870 and didn't make attendance mandatory until 1880.54. To compete with the Germans, many felt that we needed to emulate their educational practices, which could explain why the last states to make education compulsory did so in 1918, the last year of World War I. We saw a similar shift in education policy in the 1950s, when America was galvanized by a new threat, the Soviets' launch of the Sputnik satellite. The end of the debate. Not everyone was on the compulsory education bandwagon, however. Some felt that government interference in education was a violation of individual rights and the sovereignty of the family. In the 1890s, Pennsylvania's governor vetoed 2 compulsory education bills, and in 1892, the Democratic Party stated as part of its national platform, "We are opposed to state interference with parental rights and rights of conscience in the education of children." 55 Figure 2.2. School versus work. U.S. Census data show the dramatic shift from school to work that occurred for teens during the 20th century. The problem with the all-school no-work gap, right side of graph, is that it isolates teens completely from adults, trapping them in a peer culture that has very little in common with the real world they are about to enter. Source: data adapted from Fussell and Furstenberg, 2005. Early compulsory education laws required relatively little class time, but the requirements have grown over the years. According to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, by the early 1920s, all meaningful debate over the virtue of compulsory attendance had ceased. The discussions that continued centered on how compulsory attendance should be enforced, and for how long. The minimum age for compulsory attendance was forced steadily lower. Early compulsory attendance laws generally did not require attendance until a child turned 8, and in Ohio and South Dakota, attendance was not required until age 10. Today, 28 states require attendance of 6-year-olds. In 1887, only Washington state required attendance to age 18. Today, 14 states do. The average length of the school term was also growing. From 1887 until today, the average school term swelled from 130 to 180 days. 56 As you may recall from Chapter 1, some educators today are talking seriously about expanding the school day, expanding the school year, or even adding 2 more years to high school. The age of majority. We all know that people under 18 are minors, and we tend to accept this designation as if it existed through all eternity. Not so. The age of majority was actually lowered in the United States not long ago, and young people have many rights long before they reach this magical and entirely arbitrary age. What does majority actually mean? Basically, it's the age at which a young person is granted the balance of civil rights which he or she doesn't already have. Majority marks full adulthood, in the sense that there may be no right left for a culture to confer, although there are exceptions to this rule. In our culture, the civil rights that are usually withheld until the age of majority are the right to enlist in the military without the consent of a parent, the right to inherit property, the right to vote, the right to refuse or consent to medical treatment, the right to sign contracts, the right to buy and sell property, including stock, the right to marry without parental consent, the right to file lawsuits, the right to make or revoke a will. Minors already have a great many rights, but they can do nothing on the above list, generally speaking. What's more, almost any right can be conferred at ages other than the age of majority. Many states issue driver's licenses to 16-year-olds, for example, or prohibit people from buying alcohol until 21. Most of the specific rights of majority are determined state by state. See Table, Chapter 13. Majority is an old concept, with precursors in the Bible, according to which 20, not 13 or 18 or 21, was the magical age at which a few final rights were granted. Chapter 12. In ancient Rome, pubertas, generally reached at 14 for males and 12 for females, marked the age at which most majority rights were achieved, including the right to make contracts, own property, make wills and enter into marriage. 57. Even though until recent times young people were integrated into adult society soon after puberty, a few rights were typically withheld until an arbitrary age or until young people got married, whichever came first. Until the industrial era, the list of rights that were withheld was typically fairly short. For example, in the 1640s, the Massachusetts General Court specified 21 as the age for passing away of lands, bequeathing property, and for giving of votes, verdicts or sentences in any civil courts or causes. 58. Since no other rights were mentioned, it's likely that few other rights had previously been withheld. Presumably, restrictions of this sort were imposed because the ruling elders of the time believed that certain actions, making out a will, for example, couldn't be performed properly until one had accumulated a great deal of knowledge and experience. In some cases, majority rules also helped to protect property rights and the political status quo. It's only in recent times, however, that we've imposed significant and wide-ranging minority restrictions. New crimes by the dozen, compulsory education laws and laws restricting labor by young people were new, but the industrial era also gave rise to dozens of laws of truly unique character. They singled out behavior that had never been subject to laws or regulations before, sometimes driven by new technologies, such as the automobile, and sometimes driven by moral concerns. Here is a sampling of the kinds of laws that were emerging in the late 1800s and beyond: singing, smoking and more. In Indiana in 1889, people under 18 were prohibited from singing, playing a musical instrument, or begging on the streets. Females under 12 were prohibited from working as prostitutes, and young people under 12 were prohibited from walking on ropes or wires or performing as acrobats. Although the United States Surgeon General didn't condemn cigarette smoking until 1964, reformers in the late 1800s, increasingly concerned about the fragility of youth, lobbied hard to ban the sale of cigarettes to young people. Women, after all, also considered frail, were strongly discouraged from smoking in public until well into the 1900s. By 1890, 21 states and territories had such bans in place, usually for people under 16.59. Laws were also passed to discourage teen sexuality. Drinking alcohol. On December 18, 1917, under pressure from the Anti-Saloon League and other temperance groups, Congress passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. It was ratified by the states in just over a year, on January 16, 1919. The resulting laws didn't stop people from drinking, of course, just as today's marijuana laws don't stop people from smoking marijuana. 60. The main effect of prohibition was to drive alcohol manufacture, sales and consumption underground, putting much of the industry into the hands of organized crime. 61. The curious thing is that before prohibition, young people were often free to drink, or at least as free as adults were. In many states, young children equipped merely with a note from a parent could even purchase alcohol. 62. Widespread bans on teen drinking only began when prohibition ended. When the 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933, most states retained bans on drinking by young people, often setting the minimum drinking age at 21.63. In other words, we shifted from being a society where everyone could drink, except in states that had already banned alcohol in the years just prior to prohibition, to one where no one could drink, to one where everyone but young people could drink. By 1933, with all young people forced to attend school and many forced out of the job market, the idea that all young people were incompetent was firmly embedded in American consciousness. Driving. The first restrictions on driving in California were enacted in 1913. Horseless buggies had been around for more than 20 years at this point, and more than 6,000 motor vehicles were registered in California in 1905 alone. Under the new law, drivers were supposed to be at least 16, but no license or examination was required for people to drive. 64 It wasn't until about 1940 that most states had laws in place similar to those in effect today, requiring drivers to be at least 16 and to take some sort of driving test. 65 Incorrigible behavior. Many of the new laws were especially intrusive, focusing on youthful activities that had either been long ignored or handled quietly or informally, usually within families. Illinois was especially aggressive. In 1879, the legislature passed the Industrial School for Girls Bill, which allowed authorities to commit minor females to state industrial schools, a variation on the reformatory, until 18 if they frequented any street, lacked proper parental care, consort, ed, with reputed thieves or other vicious persons, or were found in a house of ill fame. 67 A similar bill was passed for young males in 1883, allowing the state to commit them to industrial schools until they turned 21. 68 Illinois also passed laws prohibiting young people from going to movies or dance halls, fighting, staying out past a certain hour, and behaving incorrigibly. 69 Note that virtually all of these newly defined crimes had no victims. They were, if anything, crimes against oneself, at least from the perspective of the authorities. And most of these indiscretions were typical of the working class and poor, which raises questions about the motives of the people who fought for such laws. The turbulent 60s is for the acceleration of restrictions that began in the 1960s. I'm old enough to remember what happened. The times, as Bob Dylan put it, they were awe-changin'. In the 1950s, young Americans were fairly docile, but over the course of the 1960s, many went wild. Marijuana, LSD and other drugs became commonplace in high schools and colleges. The advent of the birth control pill spawned the free love movement. The rising death toll in Vietnam, ultimately, over 50,000, led to a massive protest movement. Court decisions and legislation regarding civil rights led to race riots, often spearheaded by teens. The national crime rate jumped 110% during the 1960s and an additional 48% during the 1970s. 70 The United States was, in some respects, a battlefield, and young people almost always seemed to be on the front lines. To those in power it appeared that young people were out of control. It's also possible that instability in society was simply allowing young people to re-establish themselves as young adults, as thoughtful, potentially valuable members of society. But by the 1960s, few adults in America could conceive of teens as anything but incompetent, troublesome children. The sadly predictable response was to put stronger controls in place. After all, if your toddler keeps opening the front gate and running into the street, you build a tougher gate and put a lock on it. Young people in action from food fight to handcuffs. In 2009, Dylan Mitchell and 4 other students at the Portage High School in Wisconsin started a food fight by flinging cups of yogurt in the school cafeteria. The principal, Karen Exo, was not amused. Her call to the police resulted in the arrest of the students and $172 fines for disorderly conduct. As they were being escorted out, the students got a standing ovation from their peers. It was pretty sweet, said Mitchell. 66 Laws passed in recent decades which restrict young people include, among others, new curfew laws. In what an ACLU lawyer dubbed a curfew fever, 71 cities around the country have passed a variety of strict curfew laws in recent decades, ostensibly to reduce crime, although no evidence exists to support the claim that curfews have that effect. 72 In 1994, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a Dallas ordinance prohibiting minors from being in public areas at night, and now Dallas has gone to a new extreme, prohibiting people under 17 from being on city streets during daytime school hours. 73 Tougher driving laws. Until a few years ago, most states issued unrestricted driver's licenses to teens who could pass a test at age 16. Now 49 states have established, graduated, systems for issuing licenses. At first, a teen may be able to drive only with a supervising adult family member. At some point, the teen may be able to drive only with certain passengers in the car. At a higher stage, the teen may be able to drive alone but only during certain hours. In New York, full driving privileges aren't attained until age 18, no matter what one's level of competence. North Dakota, the only state without a graduated system, allows young people to obtain a full license at 14 and a half. 74 Laws restricting teen wages. Although minors are protected by the 1963 Federal Equal Pay Act, which requires that males and females get equal pay for equal work, under amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act, working minors are often exempt from the minimum wage requirement. Depending on the job, minors have to make do with between 75 and 85% of the minimum wage, and even 18 and 19-year-olds may be subject to a reduced minimum wage during their first 90 consecutive calendar days of employment. 75 Laws preventing young people from entering places of amusement. In 1983, a court upheld a Colorado law that prohibited people under 16 from entering arcades during school hours unless accompanied by an adult. 76 In 1981, a court upheld a far more restrictive law in Illinois that required that video games can be placed only in licensed liquor establishments and that people had to be at least 21 to play them unless accompanied by an adult. 77 Similar laws in some states prohibit minors from entering pool halls, dance halls and other places of iniquity. In 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the validity of such laws, asserting that authorities have a legitimate right to protect teens from the corrupting influence of older teenagers and young adults. 78 New laws curtailing potentially erotic activities. In 1989, an appeals court upheld the validity of a new rule prohibiting dances in schools in a school district in Missouri. 79 In 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a New York statute prohibiting the sale of obscene material to people under 17 based on the appeal of such materials to minors. In other words, the statute encompassed material that would not necessarily be considered obscene to adults and thus established a new and separate obscenity standard for minors. Justice Stewart justified the ruling by suggesting that a child is not possessed of that full capacity for individual choice which is the presumption of First Amendment guarantees. 80 Restrictions on free speech at school. In 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the freedom of the press guaranteed by the First Amendment does not apply to school newspapers. 81 Presumably, eminent writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, The Pit and the Pendulum, Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, and S. E. Hinton, the Outsiders, all of whom wrote disturbing works in their teens, would have been prohibited under current laws from sharing their work with their peers. In 2001, a 15-year-old in San Jose, California was expelled from school and sentenced to 100 days in a state reformatory for writing a poem that contained the lines, "For I can be the next kid to bring guns to kill students at school. For I am dark, destructive and dangerous." 82 In 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down two dramatic decisions further curtailing the free speech rights of students, one involving the wearing of a t-shirt critical of homosexuality and the other involving the display of a banner, near, but not on school property, containing the bizarre message, "Bong hits for Jesus." 83 The latest trend, prohibiting students from bringing cell phones, music players and even some calculators to school, because such devices can be used to cheat, take inappropriate photos in bathrooms and organize gang rendezvous. Students are still sneaking the phones into school, however, in some cases to mollify parents who insist on calling them frequently to check up on them. 84 Laws restricting access to the internet, movies and more. The movie rating system, first established in 1968 and revised substantially in 1990, prevents people under 17 from seeing R-rated films unless accompanied by a parent or guardian. Minors can't see NC-17, formerly X, movies at all. 85, unless, of course, they know even the minimum about how to use the internet. Libraries and schools nationwide now block access to internet material that authorities believe might be harmful to minors, and Facebook and other social networking sites are rapidly rolling out ways to protect their younger users. Internet usage on school computers is strictly regulated, and some teens have been suspended, expelled or prosecuted for setting up websites on their home computers that school officials find objectionable. 86 Efforts in the 1980s by Tipper Gore, wife of former Vice President Al Gore, to prevent teens from purchasing violent or profane audio tapes or CDs were not successful, but they did lead to a rating system. Music that contains profanities, for example, now bears the mark, parental advisory, explicit content. 87 In California, officials are fighting to preserve legislation that bans the sale of violent video games to minors. 88 New laws curtailing sexual activity. Numerous court decisions over the past few decades have upheld new state laws prohibiting sexual activity by minors or sexual activity between minors and adults. In some states, such as California, there is no age of consent, which means that no one 18 or over can have sex legally with anyone under 18. On the other hand, under mandatory reporting laws, it's okay in California for two 13-year-olds to have sex with each other. The details are complicated, surprising and ever-changing. See Chapter 8. A new type of sexual restriction involves the increasingly popular practice of sexting, sending provocative photographs by mobile phone. People as young as 13 are now being arrested nationwide for sexting, charged with crimes such as disseminating child pornography, even though they're usually sending their own photographs to a friend of the same age. Most cell phones belonging to teens these days are believed to contain indecent photos of themselves or peers. 89 New laws curtailing a young woman's right to an abortion. Various states have passed tough laws in recent decades requiring young pregnant women to get the consent of one or both parents before getting an abortion. In several rulings beginning in the late 1970s, the U.S. Supreme Court has generally upheld these laws as long as they allow for a court to bypass the required parental consent. 90 See Chapter 7 for further details. Censorship of educational materials. Propelled by concerns about political correctness, school districts nationwide have censored reading materials, sometimes taking the knife to timeless masterpieces. In 1989, an appeals court upheld a Florida high school's decision to delete portions of Aristophanes' Lysistrata and Chaucer's The Miller's Tale. Also banned recently, Kaffir Boy, The Kite Runner and a new edition of the American Heritage Dictionary. 91 Dress codes. Public schools nationwide have exercised tighter control over the way students dress, sometimes requiring uniforms, sometimes prohibiting earrings or gang emblems. The courts have generally upheld the right of schools to restrict school dress because school officials are often considered to be substitute parents. 92 The latest trends, banning perfumes and body sprays, as well as sagging pants that allow underwear to show. 93 Several districts are currently debating legislation that would even ban the wearing of sagging pants in any public area. 94 New laws governing changes in appearance. Most states have now enacted laws restricting a young person's right to get a piercing or tattoo, or even to enter a tanning salon. 95 Such laws sometimes lead teens to get their piercings done by their peers, greatly increasing the risk of infection, to get tattooed illegally or to slather on the tanning oil, much riskier than getting tanned at a salon. Laws restricting participation in lottery. All 50 states prohibit minors from purchasing lottery tickets, however, surveys suggest that children and teens purchase them routinely. 96 Tougher smoking laws. Dramatic legislation passed in 2009 now places smoking under the control of the Federal Food and Drug Administration. Presumably, restrictions on smoking by both minors and adults will soon increase. Many cities have already banned cigarette sales to minors through vending machines, and federal law prohibits selling tobacco products to people under 18 and requires retailers to verify the age of anyone who appears to be 26 or under. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, however, despite laws in all 50 states that prohibit sales to minors, numerous studies show that adolescents have little difficulty purchasing tobacco products. 98 Tougher, more uniform drinking laws. In the early 1970s, many states lowered the minimum age for alcohol consumption to 18, but the trend was short-lived. In 1984, through the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, the federal government threatened to withhold highway construction funds from states that failed to raise the minimum drinking age to 21, and by 1998, all states complied with the new mandate. 99 Military bases have typically stuck with 18, but even they are beginning to give way to the push to 21, and new laws are making it illegal for one minor to furnish alcoholic beverages to another and for minors to attend parties at which minors are drinking illegally, even if they themselves aren't drinking. 1001 New trend. Subjecting high school students to urine tests that detect alcohol consumed as long as a week prior to testing. 101 Involuntary commitment by parents or the courts. Because minors generally can't make their own decisions about medical or psychiatric care, the courts have usually found that parents or physicians, or the courts themselves, can commit teens to psychiatric or other types of gulag schools against their will, and parents are resorting to this option with increasing frequency. According to one source, the rate of commitment of minors in the United States tripled or even quadrupled between 1980 and 1998. 102 Another disturbing trend in the institutionalization of minors, the recent interlocking of the juvenile justice, child welfare and mental health systems, which has resulted in the unplanned incarceration of minors for long periods. The systems, say researchers Gary B. Melton, Philip M. Lyons and Willis J. Spalding, are substantially interchangeable, and individuals often bounce from one system to another for treatment. 103 The logic is that if one system isn't working, perhaps another one will, or at least that it will relieve the current system of the burden of care. Some of the trans-institutionalization now taking place has been made possible by the 1974 Federal Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. Although one goal of the act was to remove some minors from the juvenile justice system, in fact offenders are often simply relabeled as emotionally disturbed and placed in mental hospitals. 104 Once an individual is placed in such a facility, administrators have no incentive to release him or her. If you let the client go, the money stops flowing. Hospitalization initiated by schools. Another well-intentioned law, the 1997 Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, has also led to the involuntary institutionalization of teens. The act guarantees a free public education to people with unique needs. This sounds good, but according to Melton and colleagues, the IDEA has become a funding mechanism for psychiatric hospitalization. 105. Some courts, they say, have held that because the act is so broad, it requires schools to pay for hospitalization or other therapeutic residential placement, when the schools themselves can't provide appropriate education for students with special needs. 106. Though the costs are burdensome and sometimes prohibitive, some schools are only too willing to get such students out of their hallways. Involuntary electroshock therapy. Electroshock therapy, also known as ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, was invented in 1939, and since that time its use with minors has become more common. According to a recent book by psychologist Steve Baldwin and ECT researcher Melissa Oxlade, with minors, use of ECT escalated during the 1970s. 107. Because minors can't make decisions about their medical treatment, consent is rarely obtained. 108. Baldwin and Oxlade complain of a chronic underreporting of this form of treatment with minors, but they believe that between 500 and 3,500 minors are treated with ECT each year in the United States, in many cases for delinquency, aggressiveness or other tendencies that wouldn't normally be considered signs of mental illness. 109. But the real tragedy here is that, according to the authors, there is no scientific evidence to support the use of shock with minors. 110. Heightened security levels at schools. The school shootings of the late 1990s added those larger locks I talked about earlier, more metal detectors, locker inspections, drug testing, video monitoring, armed guards and even strip searches, leading researchers to conclude that many schools now look more like fortresses than learning environments. 111. The Federal Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994 set in motion zero-tolerance policies at schools nationwide and gave administrators broad powers to suspend or expel students over virtually any infraction that was even remotely weapons-related. In 2003, Savannah Redding, a 13-year-old honors student in Safford, Arizona, was strip-searched based on another student's accusation that Savannah was carrying ibuprofen tablets. No pills were found. Savannah was so humiliated by the incident that she never returned to that school. Although the U.S. Supreme Court recently decided that Savannah's constitutional rights had been violated, the court refused to hold the assistant principal who authorized the search liable for his actions. 112. On other fronts, an Oakland, California high school now monitors student behavior continuously with more than 50 video cameras. In 2001, in Central Florida, National Merit Scholar Lindsey Brown was arrested, suspended and denied the opportunity to graduate with her high school class because a security guard noticed a dull kitchen knife in the backseat of her car while it was parked on school property. In 2002, in Martinez, California, 13-year-old Jeffrey Figueroa was sentenced to juvenile hall for hitting another student in the eye with a spitball, and both he and his parents were ordered to attend anger management classes. And in 2001, in Jonesboro, Arkansas, where 4 students and a teacher had been killed by students in 1998, and, yes, this really happened, a first grader was suspended from school for pointing a breaded chicken finger at a teacher and saying, "Pow, pow, pow." 113. Tougher criminal justice laws. Reacting, and sometimes overreacting, to headlines about teen crime and school shootings, some states have made it easier to shift cases from the juvenile court system to the adult criminal justice system. Proposition 21, for example, passed in California in 2000, allows prosecutors to bypass judges in deciding to prosecute minors as adults. Electronic monitoring and more. Perhaps the most dramatic, yet subtle increase in restrictions on minors in recent years has come about because of new electronic gizmos, which are proliferating at an alarming rate. Among them, Altrac, a device that allows parents to flash the car lights and honk the horn remotely if a teen driver is speeding, DriveCam, which records a video of activity inside and outside a car, Snoopstick, which allows parents to monitor a teen's computer activity in real time over the internet, the Mosquito, which emits a high-pitched sound to keep teens from gathering near mall entrances, Ford's Mikey, which restricts top driving speed and limits radio volume, Tracking Key, which provides a continuous update on driving speed and location, and new GPS tracking devices in cell phones, cars and even sewn into clothing. New services will also tell you what food your child ordered in school today, what grades he or she got on tests, and what text messages he or she is sending to friends. AT&T's Smart Limits lets parents limit their teens' cell phone usage from afar. 114 Young people in action, hero or drug dealer. On April 22, 1998, 13-year-old Brandy Dyer had an asthma attack on her school bus. Responding to pleas for help from the bus driver, 6th grader Christine Rhodes, age 12, came to the rescue with her prescription inhaler. To Brandy's parents, Christine was a hero, but to school authorities at the Mount Airy Middle School in Mount Airy, Maryland, Christine was illegally distributing drugs, a serious matter that would remain on school records for 3 years. 97 New burdens on parents. In 2007, Eliza Kelly and then-husband George Robinson began serving 27-month sentences in Virginia for allowing their 16-year-old son and his friends to consume alcohol at a party in their home, even though she collected car keys and everyone slept over. Around the country, parents are paying new and bigger penalties for the misbehavior of their offspring. Fines up to $25,000 for vandalism. In California, fines up to $150,000 for illegally downloading music. Federal law, jail time and fines for truancy, up to 6 months and $500. In Florida, fines for injuring someone in a playground fight, up to $10,000 in California, and jail time. Fines or community service for allowing one's son or daughter to join a gang. 116 When young people are ignoring the rules, the logic goes, go after the parents. Figure 2.3. The vicious cycle. As teens become more unmanageable, society further restricts their behavior, which in turn causes some teens to act out in more extreme ways. A vicious cycle. Sometimes the restrictions we place on our teens help perpetuate a vicious cycle of action and reaction. They act out in some way, by showing disrespect, breaking an existing law or wandering into some new area of danger, such as the internet or the video arcade, and we respond with new or tougher laws, which in turn cause teens to act out even more. Figure 2.3. As you will see throughout this book, and especially in Chapter 5, and as you can see quite easily simply by looking around you, teens often react negatively when they're treated like children, sometimes with strong words and sometimes in more extreme ways. Unfortunately, as blacks and women can attest, authorities don't listen very carefully to people they consider to be incompetent or incorrigible. Restrictions coming soon. New restrictions on our young are spreading rapidly around the country, continuing the trend set in motion a century ago. More and more, behaviors that would never be considered criminal for adults are being defined as new forms of crime for our young. Just a few days ago in California, it became illegal for people under 18 to use cell phones while driving, even with a headset. 117 The logic, based on no actual data, is that teens are more easily distractible than adults. In reality, our perceptual powers and reaction times are at their peak in our early and mid-teens. See Chapter 7. Also spreading around the country, bumper stickers on teens' cars urging people to report bad driving to websites such as tell-my-mom.com and reportmyteen.com. Zero tolerance laws prohibiting people under 21 from driving with any alcohol in their systems. Penalties for cheering during graduation ceremonies. Rules against talking during school lunch to prevent choking. Bans on selling carbonated beverages to teens while on school grounds, laws restricting driving privileges based on convictions for vandalism or other non-driving related offenses, laws restricting teens' access to shopping malls, penalties for hugging or otherwise touching other students while on school grounds. Very dangerous territory, says one principal. Arrests for participating in cafeteria food fights, new efforts to prevent teens from viewing sex or violence on television, new efforts to ban advertisements that might encourage teens to drink alcohol, have sex or eat unhealthful foods, and, as I've mentioned, proposals for lots more required schooling. 118 Young people in action. The vagina monologues, sans vagina. I know this sounds absurd, or maybe even fictional, but in 2007, 16-year-old juniors Hannah Levinson, Megan Reback and Aelan Stahl were suspended from their high school in Cross River, New York for using the word vagina during a recitation of Eve Ensler's ubiquitous play, The Vagina Monologues. Ms. Ensler herself was so shaken that she agreed to speak at the school just before school board members were to meet to discuss the matter. 115 Following the recent recommendations of an advisory group established by the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council, legislators are also trying to put even more restrictions on youth labor. 119 We are also attempting to spread such restrictions around the world, in part by providing financial support, $38 million in 2006 to ILO IPEC, the International Program on the Elimination of Child Labor, sponsored by the International Labor Organization. 120 As you will see in Chapter 3, the outcomes of such interventions are sometimes disastrous. See Appendix 5 for a timeline of restrictions on teens. Origins of the child-centered family. As a child I often heard the Yiddish expression, alles für die Kinder, everything for the children, mainly from one of my grandfathers, who probably learned it when he was growing up around the turn of the 20th century. He always said it with a tired sigh, as if the very idea were exhausting. Wisdom of the ages. Goethe on parenting. Too many parents make life hard for their children by trying, too zealously, to make it easy for them. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. American radio guru Laura Schlesinger chides listeners with similar advice over the airwaves daily. She identifies herself as my child's mom and routinely advises working moms to quit their jobs and stay home with the children. The message is the same one I heard from my grandfather. Children should be the center of the family. Their needs come first. Everything for the kids. My own mother believes in this idea, but I've always detected my grandfather's sigh in her attitude. For one thing, since I was young she's had a sign on her refrigerator reading, "Insanity is inherited, you get it from your children." There's a price to be paid, it seems, for putting children on pedestals. Child-centered thinking is now firmly entrenched in American culture, however exhausting it might be. Where did it come from? The child as animal. Which do you think came first, laws against cruelty to children or laws against cruelty to animals? Given today's thinking, the logical answer would be children, but that isn't so. Parental authority was considered so absolute during most of human history that no state authority would dare to interfere with it. Children were indeed little more than family, chattel, as Donald T. Kramer told us. Government reached out to help defenseless animals long before it worried about children. The first law to protect animals was passed by the British Parliament in 1822, and 2 years later the British Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was formed. The American version, the ASPCA, didn't appear until 1866, and the first legislation protecting animals in the United States was passed that same year. The New York branch of the ASPCA, the NYSPCA, run by its founder Henry Bergh, proved to be the catalyst that finally put children on the legal map. 121 Mary Ellen Wilson was a 9-year-old girl who was beaten daily by her foster parents. In 1874, mission worker Etta Wheeler took it upon herself to rescue Mary Ellen, but the authorities were uncooperative. No laws existed that prohibited such abuse. As a last resort, Wheeler approached the NYSPCA for help. Bergh took the case, arguing to a New York Supreme Court justice that Mary Ellen deserved protection as a human animal. Remarkably, in an 1875 decision, Justice Abraham R. Lawrence ruled in his favor, and Mary Ellen was saved. 122 This landmark ruling laid the foundation for the modern child protection movement. That same year saw the founding of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the first society of its kind in the world. Two similar organizations were founded in Massachusetts in 1877 and 1878, respectively. England finally caught up in 1884 with the founding of its National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. 123 A New York Supreme Court justice had, in effect, decided that government has an interest in protecting all of its citizens, even little ones, and that this interest supersedes the interest that a parent has in raising his or her children. With increasing frequency, authorities began to remove children forcibly from abusive or neglectful parents, and their right to do so has since been clarified and expanded in scores of laws and court decisions. Children not only need protection, they need the state's protection. This simple idea, which most people in the industrialized world take for granted today, barely existed in the human psyche until 1875, and it followed and was inspired by the state's interest in protecting animals. Again, it's clear that the sentimental view of children is a fairly recent phenomenon in human history. Felipe Ayres may have been wrong in his assertion that childhood was invented in the 1800s, but it's undeniable that the status of children changed dramatically on the timetable Ayres specified. Jane Addams, mother of the world. When Jane Addams was barely 3 years old, sickly, homely and very vulnerable, her mother died. Perhaps the loss of mother love at a critical time in her young life led her to experience exaggerated feelings of motherhood, a sense that all of humankind needed to benefit from her nurturing instincts. She was also born with a spine so deformed that she was never able to have children. Whatever her motivations, she was an extraordinary individual, known during the early 20th century as the mother of the world. When it comes to teens, however, I think her good intentions went awry. Laura Jane Addams was born in Illinois in 1860, the daughter of a wealthy mill owner and state senator. She completed her undergraduate education at age 21 at the Rockford Female Seminary in Illinois, a school with a strong missionary tradition. Her 59-year-old father died unexpectedly the same year, and soon after his death she had an emotional breakdown. She was subsequently diagnosed with neurasthenia, a condition we would probably label major depression today, from which she suffered for at least the next 8 years. She spent most of those years traveling through Europe, where she was shaken by the suffering of the poor and homeless who crowded Europe's newly industrialized cities. 125 She later recalled her distress upon witnessing poor people bidding on rotten vegetables one night in London. Their pale faces were dominated by that most unlovely of human expressions, the cunning and shrewdness of the bargain hunter who starves if he cannot make a successful trade, and yet the final impression was not of ragged, tawdry clothing nor of pinched and sallow faces, but of myriads of hands, empty, pathetic, nerveless, and worn workworn, showing white in the uncertain light of the street, and clutching forward for food which was already unfit to eat. 126 On a subsequent trip to Europe, she also visited London's Toynbee Hall, a social settlement house devoted to helping the poor and oppressed, and she was inspired by the kindness she witnessed there. 127 Her Quaker upbringing, seminary training and travels on the continent set her on a righteous path to relieve the suffering of the poor, bring education to the masses, improve the lot of women and children and immigrants, and bring peace to humankind. Perhaps it sounds like she bit off more than she could chew, but over her long and illustrious career Addams actually accomplished most of her goals. Hull House. In September 1889, Jane Addams and her friend Ellen Gates Starr opened Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago's downtrodden 19th Ward, the first of many such institutions in the United States. Its initial purpose was to improve the lot and the lives of its poor immigrant neighbors, but within 4 or 5 years the house's mission expanded enormously. Addams, the settlement's zealous and indefatigable director, soon realized that the many good deeds the house did for those in desperate need could not but seem futile and superficial. 128 To have a significant impact on social welfare, one must, she concluded, move into the political realm. Addams soon made Hull House a center for clubs, classes, organizations and political initiatives serving many causes and populations and bringing together some of the most capable and formidable women of her day. Bear in mind that the late 1800s produced some of America's first female college graduates and professionally trained women. The very cream of the crop ended up at Hull House at one time or another. The impact of Hull House on both American thinking and government policy was nothing short of amazing. Unless you are a history buff, you may never have heard of Hull House before, but it's likely that people or programs connected with it have affected you throughout your life. Young People in Action. Wayward Women. Ruth Alexander, a history professor at Colorado State University and author of the book The Girl Problem, has taken a careful look at some of the young women who were committed to New York State reformatories in the early 1900s. Ella Waldstein was typical. At 16, she was going around with a bad crowd of girls, and her conservative, working-class parents suspected her of getting involved with an older married man. After repeatedly ignoring her parents' directives to stay home in the evenings, they took her to juvenile court, where she was convicted of willful disobedience and committed to the New York State Reformatory for Women at Bedford Hills for the standard 3-year sentence. The women in such facilities, says Alexander, were poor or working class, and most were seeking independence from their families or caretakers, sometimes because of abuse. The only thing I wanted, said one of the young women she studied, was freedom. 124 Multiple movements. One building. The emergence of adolescence coincided with 3 other major upheavals in American history: the Industrial Revolution, which ultimately spawned the child labor laws, the first significant one having been passed in 1848, as I noted earlier, the beginning of widespread compulsory education. The first compulsory attendance law was passed in 1852, and the women's rights movement. The first convention to promote women's rights was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. 3 major movements were all set in motion in the blink of an eye. This is no coincidence. With women finally beginning to get a voice in public policy making, it's no surprise that one of their traditional concerns, the protection of children, would find new outlets. 129 It's a bonus to find that all of these movements ended up under one roof for several decades. Consider this remarkable statement from the 1926 Congressional Record Report on Hull House. Practically all the radicalism started among women in the United States center about Hull House, Chicago, and the Children's Bureau, at Washington, with a dynasty of Hull House graduates in charge of it since its creation. 130 Also consider a comment by University of Chicago scholar Jean Bethke Elshtain in the introduction to the Jane Addams Reader. Nearly every piece of major reform in the years 1895 to 1930 came with Jane Addams' name attached in one way or another, including labor and housing regulations, employment regulations for women and children, the 8-hour workday, old age and unemployment insurance, as well as measures against prostitution, corrupt politicking, advice for public officials, public playgrounds, and the creation of juvenile and domestic court systems. 131 The Hull House legacy. Addams' reach was extraordinary. She either founded, helped to found, or was a major player in the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, the Juvenile Protective Association, the Immigrants Protective League, the Campfire Girls, the National Child Labor Committee, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the National Consumers League, the National Peace Congress, the Women's Peace Party, and at least a dozen other major organizations. 132 She and her colleagues were also behind major new legislation requiring school attendance and restricting youth labor, including the 1903 Illinois law I mentioned earlier. Adams also set in motion the world's first juvenile justice system, in Cook County, Illinois in 1899. More about this shortly. Was a major player in the women's suffrage movement, which finally secured the vote for American women in 1920. Was influential in the creation of at least 4 labor unions, all founded on the premises of Hull House, and was one of the world's most active and influential advocates for world peace. For her peacemaking efforts, Adams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, making her the first woman ever to have won this mother of all prizes. 133 Hull House also spawned the first Boy Scout troop in Chicago, the first public swimming pool in Chicago, the first public playground in Chicago, the first free art exhibits in Chicago, the first college extension courses in Chicago, the first public kitchen in Chicago, the nation's first model tenement code, and the nation's first citizen preparation classes, among many other innovative social programs. 134 Adams gave formidable women from around the country a powerful platform from which to launch reforms. Influential Hull House residents included, among many others, Alzina Stevens, who became the first probation officer in the world's first juvenile court and who also helped create legislation in Illinois that shortened the workday for women and children. Julia Lathrop, who eventually became the first director of the Federal Children's Bureau. Florence Kelley, who helped create legislation to establish a minimum wage. Edith Abbott and Safwan Isba Breckinridge, who were active in women's suffrage and who helped create the nation's first university-based school of social work at the University of Chicago. Grace Abbott, Edith's sister, the force behind the 1921 Federal Shepherd-Towner Act, which became a model for later legislation providing welfare assistance for women and children. 135 Not everyone was a fan, however. Industrialists branded Adams a socialist, the American Legion denounced her repeatedly, and the Daughters of the American Revolution called her a factor in a movement to destroy civilization and Christianity. 136 She was, after all, a major threat to the status quo, and her staunch opposition to United States involvement in World War I appeared unpatriotic. But millions of others knew her as Saint Jane, and she was indeed a sort of mother to the world. Hull House continued to function after Adams' death, but in a much lower key and with much shakier funding. Finally, in 1963, most of the Hull House buildings were torn down to make room for a new campus of the University of Illinois. The original mansion has been retained as a museum. I've taken us on this foray into Jane Addams' universe in order to try to personalize the artificial extension of childhood. Addams and others like her had strong convictions and powerful voices and connections. They had many agendas, and one was to protect children and teens. But not all of their motives were benign, and some of the programs they set in motion have had negative consequences. More important, some of Addams' allies in the movement to save young people had very different agendas than did Addams herself. New Forms of Social Control in 1969, Anthony M. Platt, a longtime professor of social work at California State University, Sacramento, published a provocative little book, The Child Savers, The Invention of Delinquency *, which questioned the motives of Addams and some of her associates. Were the efforts of the child savers, Felix Adler, Henry Berg and the legions of determined women at Hull House, entirely benevolent? Definitely not, says Platt. Virtually all of the leaders in this movement were members of the new middle class or, in the case of Adams, Breckinridge, Kelley and many others at Hull House, the wealthy upper class. Adams' father, says Platt, was one of the richest men in northern Illinois and her brother, Harry Haldeman, was a socialite from Baltimore who later amassed a large fortune in Kansas City. 137 Adams never received a salary from Hull House because she didn't need one. Platt argues that many of these reformers weren't really protecting young people but rather were devising new forms of social control to protect their power and prestige. 138 They were protecting themselves, he says, not the people they appeared to serve. Platt is especially skeptical about the new juvenile justice system and, to some extent, the promotion of compulsory education in the child labor laws. Here are 3 of the major ideas he developed in his book, Platt on the Child Labor Laws. Progressivism, the political movement that encompassed many of the social reforms of the day, was predominantly a businessman's movement, says Platt. Child labor legislation was often propelled by big business because upper-class industrialists did not depend on cheap child labor for their manufacturing operations. He cites historian Jeremy Felt's History of Child Labor Reform in New York, which shows that the abolition of child labor could be viewed as a means of driving out marginal manufacturer and tenement operators. 139 Prohibit child labor, said Felt, and you destroy the weak competition. The same strategy is being used today in the struggle between corporate giants such as Walmart and Kmart. Show that your competitor is employing young children in sweatshops overseas, and you can drive the consumer away and force higher labor costs on the competitor. Platt on compulsory education. Compulsory education, says Platt, was viewed by leading industrialists as a means of controlling the poor and working classes and, specifically, of preparing them for work in new industrial America. Platt quotes passages from an 1880 work by Charles Loring Brace, The Dangerous Classes of New York, which insisted that young people must be prepared for industrial discipline. In the interests of public order, of liberty, of property, for the sake of our own safety and the endurance of free institutions here, wrote Brace, the state needs a strict and careful law, which shall compel every minor to learn to read and write, under severe penalties in the case of disobedience. 140 Not long after, says Platt, the working class had imposed upon them a sterile and authoritarian educational system which mirrored the ethos of the corporate workplace and was designed to serve as a selection mechanism for the workforce. This is one of the ways in which the agendas of people like Jane Addams overlapped with the agendas of the industrialists. Says Platt, while urban reformers struggled from a moral perspective to pass legislation against child labor and for compulsory education, corporate reformers supported such reforms out of economic necessity. Thus, the child-saving movement, in its efforts to augment the family with compulsory education and other measures of state intervention, played an important role in helping to reproduce a specialized and disciplined labor force. 141 Platt on juvenile justice. Here Platt is effusive. The child savers, he said, had a strong and explicit moral agenda, directed mainly at the lower classes. Addams was appalled by temptations available to young people on the streets surrounding Hull House. Never before have such numbers of young boys earned money, and felt themselves free to spend it as they choose in the midst of vice deliberately disguised as pleasure. Let us know the modern city in its weakness and wickedness, and then seek to rectify and purify it until it shall be free at least from the grosser temptations which now beset the young people who are living in its tenement houses and working in its factories. 142 Perhaps the main reason we now treat teens like children is because of the determined efforts of Addams and others to save teens from the sinful culture of the city streets. In a book published in 1880, prison reformer Enoch C. Wines, at one point an administrator with the Prison Association of New York, wrote of the depraved habits and filthy condition of young people on the streets of Chicago, where the seeds of crime were being planted daily. They must be saved, he proclaimed. 143 But in focusing on depraved behavior that was repugnant to the upper classes, behavior that was usually victimless and non-criminal, the reformers, says Platt, brought attention to, and, in so doing, invented new categories of youthful misbehavior. The creation of the juvenile court, which by 1928 had spread to all but 2 states, brought such behaviors under government control. In other words, it gave authorities excuses to round up and put away virtually any young people, and especially those of the lower classes. Young people could now be rounded up in large numbers for behaviors such as drinking, begging, roaming the streets, frequenting dance halls and movies, fighting, sexuality, and staying out late. Wisdom of the ages. The missing stage of people in the 1500s were aware of the tumultuous stage of life we call adolescence. Shakespeare seems to have been in the dark. Here are his 7 stages of life. One man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. And then the whining schoolboy, with his satchel. And then the lover, sighing like furnace, with a woeful ballad. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths, and bearded like the pard. And then the justice, in fair round belly with good capon lind. The 6th stage shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side. Last scene of all, that ends this strange eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. William Shakespeare, As You Like It, 1598. During the early years of the new Chicago Juvenile Court, says Platt, more than half of the delinquency cases were based on charges such as immorality, vagrancy, truancy, disorderly behavior, and incorrigibility. Worse still, in many cases the court acted where no offense had actually been committed but where, for example, a child was posing problems for some person in authority, such as a parent or social worker. 144 Platt cites a 1910 report by Harvey Baker of the Boston Juvenile Court which explains that a young person might be picked up for an offense as small as playing ball on the street and then committed to reform school when he was subsequently found to have a history of troublesome habits. 145 The dark side of juvenile justice. On the outside, the juvenile justice system served noble purposes, to prevent young people from turning into hardened criminals, to isolate them from adult prisons where they might be corrupted or harmed, to keep their records private so that they could start a new life when finally released by the system, and to educate them and nurture them so that they might become good citizens. But the system had a dark side, as well. Delinquency laws gave public officials absolute authority to sweep the streets of undesirable young people for virtually any reason. And because juvenile proceedings were informal, the offenders were denied due process rights guaranteed to all Americans under the Constitution. With the creation of the juvenile justice system, the Fifth Amendment guaranteed that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and the Sixth Amendment guarantees that the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury, with the assistance of counsel for his defense, were taken away from young people. 146 Juvenile delinquency had been recognized long before Adams was on the scene. The first home for delinquents had been established, in fact, in 1825 in New York. 147 But before the juvenile justice system was invented at the end of the century, teens still retained their fundamental rights and, more important, their minor infractions were largely ignored or dealt with by family and church. Major crimes by young people were handled by the criminal courts. Punishments could be severe. In a handful of cases, young people were even hanged. 148 But serious crimes were dealt with in the criminal trial setting, where acquittals and appeals were common, just as with adults. The juvenile justice system, however, left young people completely defenseless. Even as of the early 1960s, in many states less than 5% of juvenile offenders were represented by counsel, no juries were allowed, and most hearings were held in secret. 149 Yet the system could instantly lock someone up for years. No representation, no due process, no jury, no appeals, and, in many states, private hearings and secret records, a sort of gulag archipelago for troublesome young people. This is, according to Platt, exactly what some of the early reformers had in mind, the quick and sure containment of the children of the poor and working class. Since the reformers' own children generally lived privileged lives, they were safe from the system. To make matters worse, the benevolent system Adams and her associates had in mind quickly metamorphosed into a harsh world of extreme military-style regimentation, manacling, whippings, and solitary confinement. Adams considered young people to be fragile and incompetent, creatures of innocence and tender beauty, desperately needing adult protection and a mother's love. Juvenile facilities, she believed, should be supportive and comforting, not punishing, and they should be supervised or staffed by nurturing women, given that women are natural caretakers. 150 But teens aren't children, and administrators soon turned to draconian methods to try to keep their reluctant wards under control. They realized, said Platt, that sentimental humanitarianism had no place in their work. By the 1920s, the sentimentalist hopes of the child savers had been largely dashed. On a 1925 visit to one of the New Illinois reformatories, Louise de Coven Bowen, one of Hull House's wealthiest and most devoted patrons, reported sadly that the facility had every appearance of being a jail, with its barred windows and locked doors. The children have fewer comforts than do criminals confined in the county jail. They are not kept sufficiently occupied and have very little fresh air. 151 Even more disturbing, there is considerable evidence that the juvenile justice system set in motion by Hull House residents a century ago simply hasn't worked. There's little evidence that the system lowers crime. Recidivism rates are typically as high as 60%. Reformatories have generally become more punitive and increasingly overcrowded, in part because of a dramatic decline in federal funding in recent years. 152 And a number of studies indicate that teens who become inmates at juvenile facilities are harmed by the experience, not helped. An extensive study of the system published by the National Research Council in 2001 concludes, increasing numbers of young people are placed in secure detention, which disrupts young people's lives and has negative effects on behavior and future developmental trajectories. Incarcerated juveniles have higher rates of physical injury and mental health problems, and they have poorer educational outcomes than do their counterparts who are treated, emphasis added, in the community. Incarceration also causes severe and long-term problems with future employment, leaving ex-offenders with few economic alternatives to crime. From the few available data, it appears that the rate of juveniles placed in custodial institutions has increased substantially in the past 2 decades, leading to widespread overcrowding and detention in other correctional facilities. 153 How the child savers viewed youth. The child savers, concludes Platt, defined youth as a troublesome period of life based on their own class-based, moralistic biases and then created an infrastructure that mass-produced young people in the image they themselves had invented, dependent, angry and incompetent. They robbed the young of their independence, imprisoned them over trifles, and denied them their most fundamental rights. And once the new law enforcement system was in place, said Platt, young people were trapped in a cuckoo's nest-like system where residents were powerless and resistance was considered to be yet another sign of pathology. The consolidation of the dependent status of problematic youth was complete. Young people were denied the option of withdrawing from or changing the institutions which governed their lives. Their opposition to or disenchantment with the school of reformatory or recreation center was treated as a problem of personal maladjustment which evoked therapeutic programs from the child savers. 154 Whatever the motives of Adams and her various contemporaries, we need to consider the very real possibility that the Hull House agenda was detrimental in some ways to both our young people and our society. It isolated many teens from the working world. It forced teens to attend school, whether or not they were ready to learn. It isolated teens from adults, laying the seeds for the creation of teen culture. It deprived teens of basic constitutional rights, such as the right of due process. It imposed harsh moral standards on teen behavior, bringing age-related crimes against oneself under governmental control. It reified the teen years, creating a new and dark developmental stage. It made many teens angry, depressed and defiant. It created a juvenile injustice system that has probably done more harm than good, and it extended childhood well past puberty, into the late teens or even well into the 20s and beyond. The rise of youth-oriented industries. In 1918, when Walt Disney was 16, he wanted to enlist in the U.S. Army to join the fight against the Kaiser, but he was too young. He tried joining the Canadian Army but failed there too. Finally, he forged his parents' signatures on an application to join the American Ambulance Corps, a division of the Red Cross. Added to the forgery was a lie about his age. He recorded his birth year as 1900 instead of 1901. He soon found himself driving ambulances in France, arriving just after the war ended. 155 Later in life, Disney said of his adventure overseas, "The things I did those 11 months I was overseas added up to a lifetime of experience in one package." Notably for our purposes, Disney also commented, "It was such a valuable experience that I feel that if we have to send our boys into the army we should send them even younger than we do. I know being on my own at an early age has made me more self-reliant and less of a the world owes me a living type than I otherwise would have been." 156 How ironic that he was eventually to create an empire that has helped hold young people back. The early industries manufactured toys and games before the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Industries that served children or teens barely existed, but there is no doubt that young people have always engaged in various kinds of play, just as all young mammals do, especially males. Presumably this is nature's way of preparing its young to hunt, fight and court after puberty. According to Bernard Mergen, an expert on play in early America, pre-Civil War children entertained themselves with balls, jump ropes, rag and paper dolls, and far more rare wax ones, boats made from bark, marbles, hoops, tops, pocket knives and homemade sleds and kites, among other things. With few exceptions, these were created from items found outdoors or around the house. Young people also created their own minstrel shows, circuses and theatrical plays, and a common practice, it seems, was to turn over chairs and make believe they were horses and coaches. 157 Felipe Aries was fascinated by the fact that European paintings before about 1770 never depicted children's toys. To him, this was another indication that, in some sense, childhood didn't exist before modern times. It's likely, though, that young children have always played, when they weren't working or dying, anyway. It's equally clear, however, that industries that support play, as well as industries that support young people in general, are a very new phenomenon in human history. There is also no question that such industries have helped to extend childhood past puberty, just as unions and, at times, influential industrialists have done. In fact, industry, always in the process of seeking new markets, has played an important role in defining modern adolescence. At least in its superficial aspects, modern teen culture is entirely a creation of modern industry. It's no coincidence that youth-oriented industries got their start around the same time as some of the other important movements we've discussed. Industrialization created new affluence, new poverty, new cultural practices, a new middle class and increasingly protective attitudes toward young people. Combine just two of these changes, affluence and protectiveness, each emerging in a world of expanding markets and factories, and virtually any entrepreneur with the capability of mass-producing a new plaything, book or item of clothing could find buyers ready to beat a path to his or her door. As Mergen writes, men and women in the toy industry did not try to change children's toy play, rather, they exploited what they saw as fundamental to a child's life. 162 Let's look at how and when this trend played out. The Milton Bradley Company, of board game fame, The Game of Life, Candyland, Sorry, Twister, Yahtzee, etc., was one of the first American companies to devote itself to the newly created youth market, although its first product, introduced in 1860, was actually a pocket-sized set of games sold primarily to Union soldiers. The 1869 checkered Game of Life, precursor to the modern Life game, was sold to a younger audience, as were dozens of other games released over the next few decades. Parker Brothers, another board game company, Monopoly, Clue, Risk, Trivial Pursuit, etc., was founded by 16-year-old George Parker in 1884. The previous year, when he invented his first game, he was unable to get any bank loans to publish the game, which, ironically, was called banking. He raised the money on his own, printed 500 copies of the game, and turned a profit on his investors' money within a year. By the end of the 1880s, his company was selling 29 different games. Hardcore toy manufacturing got its serious start in the 1870s with creeping dolls, bears that perform, horsemen that drive furiously, boatmen that row, and steam cars that go, many imported from Europe. There were also child-size musical instruments, manufactured baseball bats. Baseball had been invented in 1845, dumbbells, toy soldiers and guns, and factory-made sleds, among other things. In marketing efforts, says Mergen, the subtext for parents was the importance of toys for their children's development and happiness. 163 If you've recently been playing Mozart symphonies for your infant child, or perhaps even for your fetus, you've fallen prey to the same subtext. The youth markets grew enormously in the 1880s and 90s, driven by increasing manufacturing capacities, a fast-growing population and, of course, the rapid expansion of the definition of childhood. Before the Civil War, there were only a handful of books for children. By the mid-1860s, as many as 300 children's books were being published each year. 164 The toy and game industries were growing so fast that an 1890 book called The Young Folks' Cyclopedia of Games and Sports needed more than 4,000 entries to cover the subject. By the early 1900s, realistic play guns came into wide use and violent forms of play became more common, perhaps, says Mergen, because of the new urban concentrations of children and enforced attendance at school. 165 Bicycles, which assumed their modern form in the 1880s, also became common. American toy manufacturers got organized early on. 1903 saw the launching of Playthings, a journal that monitors and analyzes trends in the industry. Having been in print now for over a century, the magazine is considerably thicker and glossier than it used to be. Early Playthings articles are as illuminating as they are disturbing. For example, a 1920 piece proposing that immigrant children should be Americanized by having them assemble toys in settlement houses, or a 1940 article listing hundreds of toys by season, showing how a young person's day can be taken up with toys year-round. The article, comments Mergen, shows how rapidly the toy industry permeated every moment of childhood. 166 Young people in action. The extension of dollhood. What company produces more tires than any other in the world? No, it's not Michelin or Firestone or Goodrich. It's Mattel. It takes more than 400 million tires to supply the more than 100 million Matchbox cars produced by Mattel each year, many times more than the paltry number of tires needed for real cars. Youth-oriented industries now bring in staggering sums and produce mind-boggling amounts of merchandise. Consider, in 1971, the 100 millionth visitor crossed the threshold into the original Disneyland in California. By 1986, 500 million people had visited Disney theme parks, and the current total is well over a billion. 158 Mattel now produces nearly 100 million Barbie dolls per year and has produced more than a billion of the dolls all told. 159 American toy companies sold $21 billion worth of toys in 2008. 160 The main competition for toy sales in recent years is the burgeoning video game industry, which had $21.3 billion in sales in 2008. 161 Miriam Formanek-Brunel's History of Dolls in America, Made to Play House, Dolls and Commercialization of American Girlhood, 1830 to 1930, is especially revealing, and it even gives us a new word that is highly pertinent to the theme of the book you are now reading. Post-Civil War businesses, said Formanek-Brunel, were trying to extend dollhood. They were trying to expand their markets by encouraging young females to play with dolls for as many years as possible. 168 They didn't care about childhood per se, they just wanted dollhood lengthened. In meticulous fashion, Formanek-Brunel shows how dolls changed in industrial America, and how their caretakers changed, as well. Before the Civil War, most dolls were homemade and simple, and their main function was usefulness. Girls learned to dress and care for them to practice for their future domestic roles. But soon after the Civil War, dolls became commercialized. Girls were encouraged to own and prettify as many dolls as possible. Dolls became fashion plates, endlessly mimicking the fashions worn by the upper class and coveted by the new middle class. Women became preoccupied with shopping, says Formanek-Brunel, and the new department stores became palaces of consumption. With family size shrinking, income increasing, and more opportunities for women to be outside the home, shopping for self, friends, and family was becoming a central activity, she says. Women were becoming increasingly isolated from production, that is, from the tedious tasks of making clothing, dolls or anything else that could be manufactured, and also from their children. Mothers encouraged their daughters to depend on the companionship of dolls, thereby lengthening their childhood. 169 new distribution channels helped to propel these many changes. In 1874, Macy's became the first department store to have a toy department, and other major stores quickly followed suit. In 1893, the 7-year-old Sears and Roebuck catalog added dolls to its inventory. 170 Rise of the Youth-Oriented Corporate Empires. Youth-oriented corporate empires still with us today got their start during this period. With partner Ub Iwerks, Walt Disney started the precursor to Walt Disney Productions in 1919. He bought out Iwerks' share of the company in 1930 for a modest $2,920. Hasbro, G.I. Joe, Play-Doh, My Little Pony, Furby, Pokemon, was founded in Providence, Rhode Island by brothers Henry and Helen Hassenfield in 1923. Playschool, Mr. Potato Head, Weebles, Glowworm, was founded by two teachers in Milwaukee in 1928. Fisher-Price Power Wheels, Sesame Street, Dora the Explorer, opened its doors in 1930. Mattel, Barbie, Hot Wheels, He-Man, Cabbage Patch Kids, Harry Potter toys was started in a garage in Southern California by Ruth and Elliot Handler and Harold Modson in 1945.171. These and many businesses like them mushroomed into megacorporations over the course of the 20th century, and many have become part of larger, adult-oriented, corporate America. Parker Brothers, for example, was bought by General Mills in 1968, then sold to Kenner Products in 1985, and then sold to the Tonka Corporation in 1987, which became part of Hasbro, Inc. in 1991. Hasbro, a Fortune 1000 company with 6,900 employees, has annual revenues of almost $4 billion. In addition to Parker Brothers, Hasbro also now owns Milton Bradley, Romper Room, Tonka, Kenner and Playschool. Toy outlets have also grown. Toys R Us, for example, founded in 1948, is now a $14 billion business with more than 1,500 stores. Even so, Walmart outsells all of the United States toy supermarkets. 172 young people in action. American Girls, for a mere $100, you, too, can have one of the precious dolls, without the pricey accessories, of course. And for a mere $265, you and your daughter can enjoy a day together at American Girl Place in New York City, but be sure to make reservations in advance. AGP had already taken 30,000 reservations before it opened in November 2003. The American Girl line of dolls and books, first conceived of by Pleasant T. Rowland in 1986, caters to girls 12 and under. Although the dolls and the patrons are small, the money isn't. In 1998, Mattel, maker of the Barbie line, paid Rowland about $700 million for rights to 8 dolls. 167 Disney, of course, is now one of the largest corporate empires in the world. The original Disneyland, which opened in Anaheim, California in 1954, had over 1 million visitors during its first 6 months of operation and is now one of 4 nearly identical Disneylands owned by its sprawling corporate parent, which owns more than 50 theme parks and resorts. Disney also controls at least 15 magazines, including Discover, at least 6 book publishers, including Hyperion, at least 10 movie production companies, including Buena Vista Films and Racy Miramax Films, the Disney Stores, the ABC television network, more than 20 major internet ventures, including ABC.com and Toysmart.com, 10 television stations, including WABC in New York, at least 12 cable television channels, including ESPN, the History Channel, the Disney Channel and Lifetime, several music production companies, Baby Einstein, 3 cruise ships and much more. At this writing, Disney has revenues of over $37 billion. 173, but this is only the beginning. When I was a child, toys came on the market in more or less random fashion. One year, someone invented the hula hoop, and we all spun it till we dropped. As any parent today knows, however, there's nothing random about the toy industry anymore. In 2001, we all bought Harry Potter and Monsters, Inc. toys, videos, clothes, towels and backpacks. In 2002, it was Yu-Gi-Oh!, Dora the Explorer and The Lord of the Rings. In 2003, it was Beyblade, The Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man. Why? Because extensive, almost overwhelming lines of toys and other products now accompany the release of major movies or the debut of new television shows. This occurs, at least in part, because of a 1988 alliance formed between Mattel and Disney. Such alliances had occurred before, but this one was gigantic. 175 Before a film even goes to the drawing board, or its modern digital equivalent, merchandising and other tie-in plans are made. Cartoon shows are connected to films, which are connected to theme park rides, which are connected to breakfast cereals, which are connected to clothing lines, which are connected to fast food restaurant promotions and so on. And all of this is targeted at various well-defined and highly studied youth markets. Multiple industries are at work here, highly coordinated almost in Japanese karatsu style, all locking in the spending of tens of millions of consumers for set periods of time, hundreds of millions of consumers when the foreign markets are included. But even this is only a fraction of the larger picture. I've chosen to talk mainly about toys, but today large segments of the music, fashion and publishing industries have also helped to create, define and maintain the modern troubled adolescent. I'll say more about such industries in Chapter 14 when I offer an enemies list, a Nixon-style catalog of the many businesses, organizations, and government entities that keep teens imprisoned in a world of pain and trivia. As almost every parent is aware, there is yet another industry that deliberately and very effectively holds teens back, the illegal drug industry. It may not use Madison Avenue advertising firms to spread its message, but it's a large-scale business, every bit as sophisticated as a Fortune 500 company, complete with territories, distribution networks, wholesalers, inventories, managers, executives and so on. I'll say more about drug issues in Chapter 5. If teen culture disappeared, many of these multi-billion-dollar industries would instantly collapse. If, instead, these industries disappeared, teens would probably enter the adult world much faster. Big business and teen culture, whatever the original wishes and motives of the child savers, the artificial extension of childhood was soon accelerated by the Industrial Revolution's most impressive product, big business. The tens of thousands of images we've all seen of infantile teens, Superbad, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Dude, Where's My Car? Biodome, Suburbia, of reckless and incompetent teens, Animal House, PCU, Dazed and Confused, Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, of defiant and uncontrollable teens, Breakfast Club, SLC Punk, Crazy Beautiful, of drugged and inebriated and oversexed teens, American Pie, Kids 13, Requiem for a Dream, Rules of Attraction, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Welcome to the Dollhouse, Less Than Zero, of depressed and suicidal teens, Virgin Suicides, Heathers, Donnie Darko, and of teens obsessed by fashion and rock and roll, Clueless, Detroit Rock City, Legally Blonde, 10 Things I Hate About You, New York Minute, Mean Girls, What a Girl Wants, have been fed to us by a complex system of interrelated businesses that thrive off the maintenance of the teen as child myth. To put this another way, large businesses make billions of dollars a year both by fueling teen culture and by trying to convince both adults and teens that teen culture is timeless and inevitable, even though it is neither. As you'll see in Chapter 3, in recent decades American businesses have been expanding their markets by recreating our own teen culture, with all of its negatives, around the globe. The historical forces behind adolescence. These, then, as I see them, are the major historical forces that have been driving the artificial extension of childhood in America since the mid-1800s, nurturing tendencies by women, and some men, to protect the millions of young people toiling long hours in the new factories or getting into trouble on the streets. The elevated status of women, which gave them a powerful new voice in policy making, the widespread adoption of the new view that young people are tender, helpless and incompetent, determined efforts by the new labor unions to protect the jobs and wages of older workers by pushing young people out of the workforce, the desire of leading industrialists to sweep the streets free of troublesome youths and to prepare new generations of skilled laborers through mass education, the desire of leaders in the upper and middle classes to impose their moral standards on poor and working class youths, the emergence of new businesses and industries that catered to the young and helped to create a youth culture. Before these forces emerged, the troubled teen was a rarity in human history. With these forces in play, teens rapidly became isolated from adults and increasingly unhappy about their peculiar place in society, adults in body and mind, toddlers in status. Industrial America of the late 1800s, swelling with immigrants and new wealth, was an ambitious social experiment where almost anything could happen, and where some of the grand plans people set in motion had unintended negative consequences. I have no doubt that Jane Addams, Grace Abbott, Julia Lathrop and their colleagues would be dismayed in some respects by the kind of world they helped to create, especially by the kind of teen that now exists. I've deliberately skipped an important part of teen history that we won't be able to ignore for long, the official labeling and characterization of adolescence by pioneering psychologist G. Stanley Hall in 1904. Hall didn't create the policies and programs that set modern adolescence in motion, but he identified the result, a time of storm and stress that coincides with the teen years. He didn't create adolescence, but he certainly reified it, claiming that the teen turmoil he saw at the turn of the 20th century was a necessary feature of the teen years. We'll examine Hall's views in Chapter 5. Much of the world has so far avoided heavy industrialization in Western ways. Does the troubled teen exist in countries that maintain their traditional cultures? I've already argued that the historical record shows that adolescence, as a time of turmoil, is a creation of modern Western culture. If I'm wrong and adolescence is truly a timeless, universal phenomenon, we should see it all over the world. Do we? Q. If teens are so capable, why is my 16-year-old son such a mindless, disrespectful jerk? A. First of all, it's possible that your son doesn't appear to be so mindless or jerky to his friends. He might appear to be especially cool, or bold, or even competent in various ways. His behavior is probably effective in some contexts, and your home may not be where he's trying to be effective. Second, his strange or adversarial behavior is almost certainly his way of declaring independence, growing up and asserting control over his life. That's an important possibility, well worth thinking about. Your son probably has very few legitimate ways to assert control. He can't own property, marry, move out, drink, sign contracts, enter certain movie theaters, or even urinate during the school day, anyway, without adult permission. He asserts control the few ways he can, sometimes in bizarre or pathetic ways, to be sure. If I'm right, there's a good chance that your son's jerkiness would disappear overnight if he were allowed to have real control over his life. Third, and finally, he might get angry or depressed sometimes about being treated like a child, if not by you, then by society in general. Asterisk, the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which is still in force today, was also challenged in court, but this time it held. In 1941, in U.S. v. Darby, the Supreme Court reversed its opinion in Hammer v. Dagenhart. Asterisk, the same passage grants the right of choosing of guardians to 14-year-olds. Asterisk, the book was published, to its credit, by the University of Chicago Press. The University of Chicago was founded just a few years after Hull House and became the faculty home of many of Hull House's most distinguished residents. A second edition of Platt's book appeared in 1977, also under the imprint of the University of Chicago. Asterisk, a personal note, you may have begun to suspect that I'm one of those left-wing liberal professors you've heard about. I'm not. I'm criticizing corporate America not because I have anything against big business, but because it has played a significant role in the artificial extension of childhood. At this point, the icons, clothing, shoes, music, athletic gear, makeup, soap, magazines, styles, tastes, heroes, hopes and dreams of every American teen are in the hands of a handful of corporate executives. Unlike some of the reformers of the late 1800s, these individuals have no inherent interest in the welfare of our young. Their goal is to make money, and to do that they need to preserve and expand their markets. This is bad news for our teens and families. I'll revisit this issue in Chapter 14. Chapter 3, Adolescents Abroad. We are children.